going to talk about why I think reading poetry can be a form of ministry. Basically, I'm going to show how poems can be like ministers. And I'm going to draw you into that ministry, or at least I'm going to try to draw you into that ministry, by sharing with you some of my own original poems. And just so you can pace your listening, I am going to be doing more talking and a little bit less poetry reading toward the beginning, and then later on in the talk there'll be more poetry reading and less talking. Now, before I go any further, I need to say exactly what I mean by ministry and exactly what I mean by poetry. For my purposes, a minister is someone or something that helps people make new meaning. To kind of allude to what Leah just said, I don't mean new meaning that makes suffering meaningful necessarily, but just to help people make new meaning when the coherence of their prior life narratives breaks down. So we all have interpretive frameworks that we use to make sense of ourselves and God and the world around us and each other. But our life narratives lose coherence when we experience the catastrophically unexpected. Catastrophic experiences of the unexpected could be acute crises, like falling in love or the death of a loved one. They could be chronic, ongoing crises, like the gradual alienation of a person from her faith community. Or they could be frequentative crises, like the daily experience of degenerative illness. Coping with crisis then involves making new narratives, less hollow or hurtful narratives. In short, ministry helps us revise our personal narratives to incorporate crises into our understanding, into our interpretive framework, and to recognize that new narrative, that new interpretive framework as our own. For my purposes tonight, what I mean by poetry is a verbal text that meets both of the following two conditions. 1, poetry surprises the reader by frustrating the semantic and syntactic rules on which the comprehension of prose normally depends. Think of the poem that Saeed introduced me with. I compared my poetry to a meteor caught in a vase. That's not an image that you typically run into. And think about how it used the word meteor, which is a noun, as an adjective. She'll be reading her meteor poems to you. That's breaking a rule that we normally expect. We normally expect nouns to be nouns and adjectives to be adjectives and not to sort of slip into each other. So, condition 2. Poetry is a verbal text that is explicitly labeled poetry by its context. That context could be a book cover or an author bio or a performance venue like a poetry reading, such as the one that's going to be happening tonight. Note here that I'm defining poetry not in terms of human universals, but in terms of cultural particulars. So what surprises or frustrates a reader is going to depend on her particular formation as a reader by a particular interpretive community. And likewise, what a particular publishing house or performance venue in a particular time or at a particular place identifies as poetry is also going to be a historically and culturally contingent affair. Accordingly, I'm not trying to offer an exhaustive definition of poetry. I'm not suggesting necessary or sufficient conditions for what counts as poetry. There are things that you might want to think of as poetry, and you might have really good reasons for wanting to call them poetry. Say, for example, one of you were to go home tonight and compose the following rhyme. Roses are red, violets are blue, Olivia's weird, and her poetry too. That is an example of what we call doggerel. Doggerel is it's just a fancy word for poetry so bad it's funny. I'm not going to be asking tonight how doggerel might bring us closer to God. That's beyond the scope of my inquiry. It's an interesting question, but it's not my question tonight. Also, I want to say a quick disclaimer about poetry and being good. So we all know that there are tons of poets in the world who have done super evil things. I am not suggesting that reading poetry is a magic vaccine to prevent us from being bad people. When I say that poetry has a ministerial function or that poems can be ministers, I'm talking about the potential that poems can have. So a bad reader could misuse a beautiful poem. A bad writer can write a beautiful poem, a good poem. So this is about potential, not about like a magic pill that's always going to work. So, in broad strokes, this is how I think poetry and ministry relate. Our various experiences of crises, falling in love, falling ill, gradual alienation from the faith community, loss of a loved one, they not infrequently reveal the limits of the traditional discourses that previously enabled us to refer to God. The surprises of poetic syntax and metaphor can help us talk about these experiences and refer to God without slipping back into the calcified language of tradition that wasn't working for us, that was failing us in some way. So, now I want to read one of my poems to further illustrate what I mean by the words poetry and ministry. Some background about the poem. It's called Ruth 1:16, which is a reference to a moment in the book of Ruth in the Hebrew Bible. Ruth is a Moabite woman who has befriended Naomi. She was married to Naomi's son and he died, and Naomi is an Israelite, and Naomi says, I'm going to go to my home now, you needn't come with me. And Ruth, the Moabite, says, no, actually, I want to stay with you forever, and I want to follow your God, and I want your people to be my people. So the verse that the title refers to is, where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And this is a text that is used a lot in queer weddings. There's one other thing that I want you to know about the poem before I read it. There are two characters in the poem. One of them is named Olivia. One of them is named Chloe. This is an allusion to a famous passage in Virginia Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own, where Virginia Woolf imagines a novel, like a hypothetical novel that would depict intimacy, deep intimacy between women, which was a thing that she felt hadn't really happened and she wanted to see. So Virginia Woolf writes, the very next words I read were these. Chloe liked Olivia. Do not start. Do not blush. Let us admit in the privacy of our own society that these things sometimes happen. Sometimes women do like women. Ruth 1:16. Picture two women sitting on a footbridge over a frozen pond in a South Hadley wood in January. Olivia rests her back on the truss, folds her knees to her chest, puffs a Swisher Sweet, asks, what does it mean to believe? It seems to me that the New Testament writers see faith as a black and white thing. You're either in the light or not. What about a shadowy land of inquiry in between? I want a name for people who can't really identify as skeptics because the light attracts them, or disciples because they can't stand still in it. The Gospels call me to an unfollowable world. And Chloe, watching worms of ice eat through leaves and crawl through vines knit to the bridge, says, in the New Testament, the light is God. Standing in the light doesn't come through catechism and conviction. It takes struggle and practice. John says we experience the light by walking in it as Christ did. Pascal says that if you practice the faith, you will find it to be true. Ice worms rot, sword fern and rootlet, beard grass and bloodroot. So faith isn't about epistemic confidence. It's a response to a story and the communities that try to fit their lives to that story. Vaulted pine trees glitter with ice worms. When I have doubt, confession is the work of the Holy Spirit. I can't reveal the nature of Christ to myself. I can only inquire, reason, listen, and pray. Chloe paces the bridge's length, and Olivia ashes her swisher's feet. Chloe flicks snow off her black chucks, and Olivia runs up behind her and kisses her and brushes snow out of her hair. Tell me I could still do this in the unfollowable world. You could. And this? Yes. Ice worms burrow in cruciform leaves. Ice worms harrow the juniper trees. Ice worms follow the bowl of an unfollowable world. In the poem that I just read, Olivia is experiencing the crisis of conversion, or wanting to convert, but not really thinking she can because her sexuality is an impediment to converting. And Chloe helps her make new life-giving meaning by challenging the diametric opposition of light and dark and giving those words new nuance. And at the level of the language of the poem, it does things that we don't really expect to see. It unsettles us in terms of genre. You have blocks of prose dialogue that are suddenly severed by weird, lyric, poetic, third-personal descriptions. And there's this really unsettling relationship between what's going on in the prose dialogue and what's happening in the third-personal, lyric, poetic narrations. So, to recap before we move on, I'm claiming that poems can be like ministers in that they can help us through the process of building new narratives when our old narratives have broken down. They can help us through the process of figuring out new ways to refer to God when, like Job, we experience the language of our tradition as failing us. Now I'm going to sharpen my focus and pinpoint 3 specific ways that poetry can do this. 1. Poems give us access to knowledge that isn't reducible to philosophical propositions or abstract categories. This is the kind of knowledge that we have of other persons when we enjoy a direct or an indirect relationship with them. If there's a difference between knowing that God is present in a worship service, on the one hand, and knowing the presence of God in a worship service, on the other hand. So knowing intellectually that God shows up and knowing the presence. Poetry is that which helps us access the latter. Not the knowing that, but the sort of interpersonal, experiential, and emotional knowledge that's not reducible to propositions. The philosopher Eleanor Stump makes a similar argument. I'm going to call this, for the sake of a shorthand, I'll refer to it later, the interpersonal thesis. 2, poetry breaks rules of communication that we're used to by turning a noun into a verb or by leaving out the logical connectors between ideas. If you think of the poem that Said read to introduce me, poems break rules by having rhymes that go sideways and lines that read backwards and sentences punctured with lots of white space. So teasing out the inexhaustible implications of a poetic metaphor or untangling a really knotty sentence can cultivate in us, I want to say, dispositions of attention and patience that prepare us to wait on God and to listen to our neighbor. Think of Simone Vase' essay, Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. She says that working on math problems, whether you get the answer right or not, can cultivate in us the kind of attention that we need to have a vision of God one day. And I'm saying a similar thing about poetry. And for short, I'll call this the attention thesis. 3, metaphors give us a shared provisional vocabulary for hazarding new theories about stuff that we don't have, that we can't observe directly or we can't know definitively, for example, God. Here's how metaphors do that. So any given metaphor has innumerable dimensions. Like Juliet is the sun, for example. Juliet is the sun can suggest warmth, it can suggest sustenance, it can suggest being the single sole source of brightness in life. It can also suggest Juliet's easterly position relative to Romeo. So let's say that I have an experience of God, and because of that particular experience I'm inspired to compare Christ to a kindergarten teacher at recess who wipes all the tears from the kids who crashed their tricycles into the seesaw because they didn't know any better. Presumably, when I have this metaphor of Christ as kindergarten teacher, I have one dimension in mind. But there could be innumerably many other dimensions that then subsequent readers could go and tease out of that and then think about whether they work and if so, what they mean. So by sitting with that metaphor, subsequent readers can generate novel insights and novel questions about God. Sometimes, though, metaphors die, like a blanket of snow. It's not a very interesting metaphor. And sometimes metaphors can do damage, like God is a father. So we need a continual piling up of new metaphors. And the richer and larger that stockpile of surprising metaphors is, the more resources a reader has to make new life-giving meaning when she's in crisis and the language of tradition fails her. Theologians Janet Martin Soskis and Sally McFaig make versions of that point. I'll call it the metaphor thesis for short. So now I'm going to read a poem that illustrates the interpersonal thesis. A couple of things that I'd like you to know before I read this poem. It's about Abelard and Heloise. In case you don't know their story, Abelard was a 12th century priest who was hired to teach Heloise by Heloise's uncle, and instead they had an affair. Heloise's uncle got kind of mad, so he castrated Abelard. Abelard and Heloise eventually wound up in separate monasteries where they wrote each other awesome letters. Thing two that you need to know about the poem is a dude in the 19th century named Walter Pater wrote a really beautiful meditation about Abelard that gives short shrift to Heloise. So whenever you see quotation marks in the poem that I'm about to read, those quotation marks are quoting Pater's text. And as I'm reading, keep your eyes peeled and your ears open for the way that the poem moves in and out of different kinds of poetry. So like traditional rhymey metered poetry, and then more weird meteor-like experimental poetry. Eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. Pater reminds us how Abelard, the comely clerk, in whom wisdom herself, self-possessed, pleasant, discreet, seemed to sit enthroned, joined the house of Canon Fulbert to teach his orphan niece. How shadows followed the scholar there, the slack conscience that conformed from living too long alone in abstract thought. How shadows moved over the cloistral island of Abelard's mind. According to rumor, Fulbert had testified his love for Heloise by giving her such unrivaled knowledge, Latin and Hebrew and Greek, that she could practice the holy mysteries of the older world. Curious, alacritous, Heloise at first just listened as Abelard read to her in the small room on the second story where the canon left them to themselves. The smell of meat and thatch burdened the open window. Abelard tapped his finger on the codex. Bright coriams, short slow-mouthed flames burned in her ears. girl in a sheer blue wimple worn at each lesson on her uncle, the canon's rule, went word mad, turned red, fell hell sure in love over Sappho. Later, combing unranked Jeremiah with her lover, fell still further. Love made himself of the party with them. After Abelard, as Pater tells it, found the ground of reality below the abstractions of philosophy, by feeling the hand of Heloise, by looking into her eyes and making scholastic distinctions among the kinds of blueberry, the pocket of cornflowers, the cobalt pots of Kashan, the ice chasuble of Christ Pantocrator. He composed many verses in the vulgar tongue. Already, the young men sang them on the quay below the house. Heloise listened sometimes to the longshoremen's iterations of her lover. Let playful Venus intercede to break the hermit's ecstasy. A rhyme, a kiss, a touch, a word, to fracture logic's fantasy, wholeness, self-repose, and truth. Louise, our hands and eyes belie all lonely, visionary proofs. Love, like logic, bodied forth a new kingdom, storied new ways of knowing, not opposed to, but only beyond, independent of spiritual law. Yet Heloise later realized, fucking in the refectory of the Most Holy Virgin, this is not making, this is not philosophy, this is the immediate selfish moment, votary of hip slope. This is not flesh-thinking reconciliation, this is our annihilation. So the next poem that I'm going to read picks up the Abelard and Heloise story after a certain key plot development. See in how neat a hand I am writing to you. After Heloise laid out arguments like organdy shifts, and Abelard undressed her and dressed her in them, let your eye be single, go, rest you in the arms of philosophy. And after the canon's men valvorized his prick, even at mass I only see, smell, and taste your body, soft salt, not the ciborium in the priest's hands, the boy swinging thurible, or the host on my tongue. He led her to a corner of the empty refectory and unhooked his cassock to show her. She ran her tongue like an aloe leaf, slowly, over the absences, and softly spoke, myrrh, myrrh. This wound is your guardian angel, that your eye may be single. Our penury is our penance, but the penance our best plenty. Poison of voice, parchment, and pen. Now I'd like to read a shorter poem that illustrates the metaphor thesis and the attention thesis. So just to recap those two, metaphors help us build new models of God because metaphors are inexhaustibly suggestive and we can tease out new questions, can tease out different facets of the metaphor and see whether they touch down in our lives or not. And the attention thesis is that poetry is kind of difficult and surprising, and sitting with the metaphor and teasing it out and unknotting a sentence can cultivate disciplines of patience and attention that open us up to God and to our neighbor. So the poem that I'm about to read basically uses knitting and sewing techniques as an extended metaphor for knowing God. We have a real life example of that in there are a couple of terms in the poem that you might not know, so I'm just going to unpack them. It's called catechumen knitting. A catechumen is someone who takes classes to discern whether she wants to convert to Roman Catholicism. In the poem, I also use the word bore. A bore is a wave that can cause shipwrecks, so like a water wave. And an awl, A-W-L, is a small pointy tool that you use to pierce holes in leather. Also Veronica. Veronica is the lady who, according to Catholic tradition, gave Christ a cloth while he was walking to the cross. And he wiped his face, and his face became permanently imprinted onto the cloth. If there are any other words that you don't know in the poem, they're just like really obscure techniques for making clothes or really obscure kinds of fabric. You should not worry about that. Catechumen knitting. Why slip stitch wood ponds that depend on the tsetse fly? Or sure rivers into wars that unman bosuns? What's made is always already marred. How can you rebuke what never worked? Unhook the stays you hooked this way. Why does Eve's choosing not mine? Does the soul eyelet skin? Does the pond's schooled soul? Does doubt fit here? How can I all know you? Sew your will into acts like gussets on muslin. Unpearl the scripture's curses. Loose the words gold thread from the rough puck words. How can I cross-stitch you now when you're so many cloths, shot silk and tulle and yinsook and wool? How can I rose-stitch a stole that would describe you whole as Veronica's viscous wrap, stanching in small rain? So the poem frustrates a lot of our expectations about how language is supposed to work. I repeatedly use nouns as verbs. For example, when I say, does the soul eyelet skin? Eyelet is a noun. They're little holes in leather, for example, that you can thread something through. But I'm using it here as a verb, and like the suggestion is, there are, I suppose, several ways you could read that line, but the question is, how does the soul relate to the body? Does it eyelet the skin? Does it is the skin this porous thing that the soul sort of threads through? Anyway, so that's like an example of how the poem frustrates the way language is supposed to work. And notice that that it looks like a square with a gash through it. I was trying to create a visual effect of a piece of cloth being ripped. And they're ripped right at the I and the you knowing each other, right where the I and the I-thou relationship would connect. Religare is the etymology of religion. It means to tie, which is a kind of interesting thing. I was inspired to try to create the visual effect of ripping a piece of cloth by the 17th century poet George Herbert, who a few times writes poems that are in the shape of what he's writing about. For example, he has a poem about a church altar that's in the shape of an altar. Which brings me to my last point. All of the poems that I've read so far tonight have borrowed from and riffed on previously available texts. So the Book of Ruth, Virginia Woolf's Room of One's Own, Abelard and Heloise's letters, Pater's meditation on them, George Herbert's poetry. I just want to flag the fact that as I'm writing these poems, I'm doing almost exactly what a reader who's reading poetry does in terms of the ministry that I'm describing. A reader who wants to theologize in fresh ways would do the same thing. The reader takes previously existing text, reads them, and then thinks about those metaphors in relationship to her life and explores them further, which is precisely what I'm doing as a writer. Writers are readers too. I'm mining previously available texts and riffing on them. And I see that process of mining previous texts and riffing on them and using them in new ways as an act of gratitude. It's a way of taking in beauty and letting that beauty flow out in a new form. And I want to close now with two poems, both of which I think highlight this facet of poetry as a way of performing gratitude. The first of these, they're two short poems. The first of them I wrote after a really life-giving poetry workshop that I participated in for a few years in a prison, with some men in a prison in Jackson, Michigan. So the word otto in the first line is just a version of the word adder, which is like an essential oil that you can crush roses into. Okay. I sit in my house for days on end and stare at the roses in the closet and wring out otto from 80 cabbage roses and smear it on the sides and top of the hollow steel door. Although here, there is no rose-breasted grosbeak, no long-tailed rosefinch, no rosy gull, and no window. A posy of tea roses, spray roses, Scotch roses, and moss roses, a sentry on the lintel, grows, always, even so. Before I end with my last poem, I just want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And I want to give a special shout out to Reverend Lindner and the ministry program for making the God Talks possible, and an especially special shout out to my advisor, Professor Rosengarten. I will end this talk with my final poem. We now remember the futures that were. Already, God crouches in the dust of the ground to pick up the scratched picks of our heart, and already God buffs it and polishes it with toothpaste and cotton, and already God makes it ready for the new city of the new earth. And God will say a fern green word to us. It will feel like cashmere. It will taste like beets and horseradish. God will say a word whereupon 7 billion ash trees, 3 billion chestnut trees, and the ghost forest of every timber harvest will rise up out of the ground. Trees will stand up indomitable in every clear cut. The poplar and the paper birch will stand up. The fir and the pine and the cedar and the spruce will stand up. In a field at the edge of the new city of the new earth, the tree of life will stand up, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. Already, God lodges the picks of our heart behind our rib and soothes the cut with a poultice of figs. And already, God closes the place with flesh, and already, God makes us ready for the new city of the new earth. God will put a word in our mouth, like a spoon of bitter herbs, and a word on our chest, like a swatch of wool. And we will lock arms with God, and we will lock arms with each other, and we will dance out of chrysoprase driveways onto chrysolite streets. We will find the poem of our name written in carnelian on the alley wall. We will call it trustworthy and true,